In the shadows of the American justice system, there are names not only sentenced, but etched into history as harbingers of unspeakable terror. One man murdered 2 guards to escape prison. Another wiped out an entire family, including children, out of fear of being caught. One stayed silent until the very end, then whispered, "I have no regrets." Missouri, a state that makes up less than 2% of the U.S. population, ranks among the top 5 in execution since 1976. Even more striking, many of the state's most brutal executions happened in just the past 2 decades. This is a list of the 10 most cold-blooded death row inmates, men who didn't just kill, but walked into the death chamber without ever looking back. Each left behind a story, a crime, a final meal, a last word, and sometimes a haunting silence. Before we begin, leave a comment below. Where are you watching from? Which state or country? Let's see how far these stories reach. And now let's begin with the first. First, Christopher Collings. On the night of November 3rd, 2007, in Stella, a small town in Missouri, 9-year-old Rowan Ford disappeared from her home while her mother was working a night shift. The search for her stretched on in desperate hope for days, until her body was found in a remote cave in McDonald County. Forensic evidence showed that Rowan had been severely harmed before her death. Christopher Collings, a family acquaintance who had lived with Rowan's family during the summer and early fall of 2007, quickly drew the attention of investigators. At first, Collings appeared cooperative, but inconsistencies in his statements and his refusal to meet investigators' eyes led authorities to increase the pressure. Meanwhile, Rowan's stepfather, David Spears, also raised suspicion with his behavior, prompting police to focus their investigation on both men. Under mounting pressure, Collings confessed. On that tragic night, after drinking heavily, he brought Rowan to his trailer home on family property in Wheaton. In a disturbed state, Collings committed a serious crime against the young girl. Fearing she could identify him, used a rope during the events that ended her life. It did not stop there. Collings and David Spears, who later admitted to being involved, worked together to hide Rowan's body. They carried her to a secluded cave in McDonald County, covering her with leaves and debris in a failed attempt to conceal their crime. But time and silence could not outrun justice. Forensic evidence, confessions, and clues from the scene slowly peeled back the layers of deception. Spears even led authorities to the hidden site where Rowan's remains were discovered after days, sparking a wave of deep sorrow in the community. In 2012, a jury sentenced Collings to death, a heavy sentence seen as necessary to close a dark chapter. On December 3, 2024, at the Bonne Terre Correctional Center, Christopher Collings faced his final moment, lethal injection in a cold, silent room. His last meal was strikingly simple: a bacon and cheese sandwich, fried mushrooms, French fries, and a chef's salad. Before closing his eyes, Collings delivered his final words in heavy silence. "I hope everyone can find closure and move forward. No matter which side of this you are on, you are in my prayers." In the dim, yellow light and fading breath, Missouri closed another sorrowful chapter 1, where a terrible crime had forever stolen the childhood of an innocent child. Second, Marcelus Williams. On August 11, 1998, in a quiet neighborhood of University City, Missouri, Felicia Gale, a former reporter who had left journalism to devote herself to charity work, was found dead inside her home under tragic circumstances. What had been a peaceful refuge became the scene of a crime that shook the community to its core. Marcelus Williams, a man with a criminal history of theft and assault, quickly became a prime suspect. Investigators found no DNA linking Williams directly to the murder weapon, a kitchen knife taken from Felicia's own home. However, circumstantial evidence began to form a compelling chain. Williams was found in possession of Felicia's stolen laptop, and both a former cellmate and an ex-girlfriend testified that he had confessed to the crime. According to case records, Williams had broken in intending to steal. But unexpectedly, he encountered Felicia Gale, who had just finished showering. In a panic, he used a kitchen item to attack Felicia, leading to her death. The savagery of the crime was reflected in the extent of the injuries, shocking even the most seasoned investigators. Arrested based on physical evidence and witness testimony, Williams consistently denied all charges. He and his legal team fought hard to request advanced DNA testing, pointing out that the DNA found on the weapon did not match his. Felicia Gale's family even expressed a desire that authorities refrain from carrying out the execution, believing that the full truth had not yet come to light. Despite this, after multiple appeals, both federal and state courts upheld the death sentence, concluding that the circumstantial evidence was sufficient to convict. On September 24, 2024, at Bonne Terre Correctional Center, Marcelus Williams was brought into the execution chamber, the method lethal injection technically smooth, yet heavy with the weight of every final breath. For his last meal, he chose simple comfort foods, chicken wings and tater tots, as if trying to cling to an ordinary moment. His final words echoed quietly in the frozen air. "All praise is due to Allah in all circumstances." And then, as the light faded, the debates over guilt and justice continued to ripple silently through Missouri like a question that was never fully answered. Third, Amber McLaughlin. On the evening of November 20th, 2003, Beverly Gunther, a dedicated administrative worker living in St. Louis County, Missouri, did not return home as usual. Her family found her car still parked outside her workplace, but Beverly herself had vanished. Amber McLaughlin, then known by birth name Scott McLaughlin, had once been romantically involved with Beverly. After their breakup, McLaughlin persistently stalked, harassed, and even broke into Beverly's home, defying multiple restraining orders. The fear Beverly had documented in court filings was tragically not enough to save her. According to case records, that night, McLaughlin ambushed Beverly outside her workplace. In the suffocating darkness, McLaughlin committed a fatal act of violence, then abandoned Beverly's body in a patch of overgrown weeds near a deserted trail. The evidence against McLaughlin did not come from a confession, but from a disturbing pattern stalking, breaking, and entering, threats, and Beverly's sudden, unexplained disappearance, all pieced together by witness accounts, traces, and abnormal behavior before and after the crime. In 2006, during trial, the jury could not unanimously decide on the death penalty. Under Missouri law, when a jury is deadlocked, the judge has the authority to impose the sentence. As a result, McLaughlin was sentenced to death. In the years that followed, within the cold walls of prison, McLaughlin completed a gender transition, becoming Amber McLaughlin, the first openly transgender woman to be executed in the United States. On January 3, 2023, at Bonne Terre Correctional Center, Amber McLaughlin faced her final fate, lethal injection, unfolding quietly, like a destiny long sealed. For her last meal, Amber chose a bacon and cheese sandwich, French fries, a strawberry milkshake, and a packet of peanut M&Ms, simple comforts, reaching for a final moment of peace. As the dim light spread across the room, Amber's final words trembled into the air. "I am sorry for what I did. I am a loving and caring person." And then, the light faded away, leaving behind haunting questions about love, about guilt, and about the ultimate judgments human beings pass upon one another. Fourth, Brian Dorsey. On the night of December 23, 2006, as Christmas lights brightened every small corner of New Bloomfield, Missouri, a silent crime unfolded behind quiet walls. Brian Dorsey, a cousin of Sarah Bonney, was drowning in desperate drug debts. In his despair, he called Sarah and Ben Bonney, seeking help. With kindness and no suspicion, the Bonnies welcomed Dorsey into their home, opening their door to a night they could never have foreseen. According to investigative records, As night fell and the house slipped into sleep, Dorsey quietly retrieved a handgun from the garage. In a moment he could never undo. He entered the bedroom and committed a fatal act against Sarah and Ben Bonney. The tragedy did not stop there. After taking the lives of those who had shown him compassion, Dorsey also further disrespected the victim's dignity after death, a disturbing detail noted in the investigative documents. In the aftermath, he attempted to clean the scene with bleach, stole valuables, and left the house, leaving behind the Bonnies' 4-year-old daughter, still asleep, unaware of what had transpired. 3 days later, Brian Dorsey turned himself in and confessed to the crime. In 2008, despite pleading guilty, Dorsey was sentenced to death, a verdict reflecting both the severity and betrayal embodied in his actions. On April 9, 2024, at Bonne Terre Correctional Center, Brian Dorsey faced his final sentence, lethal injection, a process smooth on the surface, yet crushing with each final breath. His last meal reflected a hollow greed, 2 bacon cheeseburgers, 2 orders of fried chicken, 2 large servings of French fries, and a pizza loaded with sausage, pepperoni, onions, mushrooms, and melted cheese. In his final moments, Brian Dorsey left behind heavy words of regret. "There are no words to fully express the shame and guilt I feel." And then, as his final breath vanished into the cold air, Missouri closed another sorrowful chapter where kindness was betrayed, and pain lingered far beyond the prison walls. 5th, Leonard Taylor. In the early days of November 2004, the Jennings area of Missouri was awash in the colors of late autumn. But inside a small house, an ominous silence began to spread, a silence that spoke louder than words. Angela Rowe, 28 years old, and her 3 young children, Alexis, Acrea, and Tyrese, suddenly stopped answering calls from family and friends. Doors remained closed. Worry grew heavy in the close-knit community. A few days later, during a welfare check, police found the bodies of Angela and her 3 children inside the house, a scene frozen in tragedy. Their deaths were determined to have occurred several days prior, under circumstances marked by fatal force. Leonard Taylor, Angela's former boyfriend, quickly became the prime suspect. Evidence, including witness testimony, travel records, and indirect confessions, gradually painted a grim picture. The investigation revealed that Taylor had been with the victims around the time of their deaths. Afterward, he fled Missouri for California, where authorities eventually tracked him down. Taylor insisted on his innocence, claiming that when he left, Angela and the children were still alive and that everything was a terrible misunderstanding. Even in the face of execution, Taylor continued to maintain his claims. The jury was not convinced. In 2008, Leonard Taylor was sentenced to death for the loss of 4 innocent lives. On February 7, 2023, at Bonne Terre Correctional Center in Missouri, Leonard Taylor faced his final moment. The method lethal injection silent, where even final words were swallowed by the air. His last meal reflected a final grasp at earthly pleasures, a seafood platter, a cheeseburger, French fries, cheesecake, and vanilla ice cream. In his final hour, Taylor showed no plea, no fear. His last words echoed through the quiet chamber, "Death is not your enemy, it is your destiny. Look forward to meeting it. Peace." And so, Leonard Taylor closed the final chapter of a tear-stained story where the silenced could not speak, and the one responsible denied until the very last breath. 6th, Joseph Paul Franklin. In the late 1970s, America was rocked by a series of sudden, deadly attacks stretching from Ohio and Tennessee to Missouri. Behind these scattered crimes stood Joseph Paul Franklin, a known extremist driven by racially motivated ideology born from racist ideology. Franklin considered himself a lone warrior, unaffiliated with any official extremist groups, but carrying out his self-proclaimed mission to purify society from what he saw as racial mixing. Obsessed with white supremacy, Franklin targeted black individuals, Jewish people, and interracial couples. He acted coldly, without warning, without mercy, causing deep fear and pain across multiple communities. Among his many attacks, one crime in particular shook Missouri on October 8, 1977. Gerald Gordon, a Jewish man, was shot and killed by Franklin outside a synagogue in St. Louis County, following a religious service. The attack did not only take a life, it sowed deep fear within the local Jewish community, a chilling reminder that hatred could tear through even the safest spaces without warning. Franklin did not stop in Missouri. He moved swiftly across dozens of states, changing his appearance, using multiple aliases, committing crimes, and vanishing like a phantom. His unpredictable movements made him an elusive target for both federal and state law enforcement. It took years of coordinated, persistent efforts before Franklin was finally captured in 1980. In Kentucky, he was charged in multiple jurisdictions for a string of murders, including the high-profile shootings of Larry Flynt, a well-known publisher, and Vernon Jordan, a civil rights leader, both of whom survived but suffered severe injuries. Ultimately, Franklin was tried and sentenced to death in Missouri for the murder of Gerald Gordon, a crime prosecutors described as purely driven by racial hatred. During his long years on death row, Franklin occasionally expressed vague remorse in interviews, claiming he no longer believed in racial hatred. Yet, in other statements, he continued to reveal extremist views, conflicting with the regret he sometimes attempted to display. On November 20th, 2013, at Bonne Terre Correctional Center, Missouri, Joseph Paul Franklin faced his final sentence, lethal injection, closing the chapter on a life steeped in violence and hatred. Unlike many death row inmates, Franklin refused a final meal, a silent choice, without explanation. In his final moments, he offered no last words. His cold, empty silence reflected the path he had chosen, a path without explanation, without redemption. 7th, Ernest Lee Johnson. On a quiet February night in 1994, the city of Columbia, Missouri, was shaken by a silent, painful tragedy. Ernest Lee Johnson, a man burdened by mental illness and drug addiction, had planned to rob a Casey's General Store, a place he frequented. But that night, the crime went far beyond theft. According to investigative records, under the influence of substances, Johnson killed 3 night shift employees, Mary Bratcher, Fred Jones, and Mabel Scruggs, with brutal violence. The event stunned Columbia, a university town unaccustomed to such horror. After the crime, Johnson attempted to hide his actions. However, forensic evidence and security footage quickly led investigators to him. He was arrested shortly thereafter and confessed to his involvement. Over the following years, Johnson's legal team raised numerous arguments regarding his mental state. They emphasized that part of Johnson's brain had been surgically removed during a 2008 operation to treat a brain tumor, significantly impairing his cognitive function and impulse control. Human rights organizations, including the United Nations and several international advocacy groups, called on Missouri to grant clemency, citing protections for individuals with intellectual disabilities against capital punishment. Despite these appeals, the Missouri Supreme Court ruled that Johnson remained capable of understanding his actions and the consequences of his crime. On October 5, 2021, at Bonne Terre Correctional Center, Ernest Lee Johnson faced his final moment, lethal injection, closing more than 2 decades of legal battles. For his last meal, Johnson chose everyday comfort foods, 2 bacon cheeseburgers, a serving of pizza, and a milkshake. In his final breaths, Johnson's last words were not of protest or justification. He spoke softly, "I am sorry and regret what I did. I love my family and friends, and I am thankful for all those who supported me." In the dim light of the execution chamber, Missouri closed another chapter marked by controversy, a chapter grappling with justice, mercy, and the fragile line between guilt and redemption. 8. Carmen Deck. On an early evening in July 1996, As 4th of July fireworks lit up Missouri's skies, a silent tragedy unfolded in DeSoto, leaving behind wounds that would never heal. Carmen Deck, then 30 years old, with a criminal record stretching back to his teenage years, had planned to break into the home of James and Zelma Long, an elderly couple living modestly. To carry out the plan, Deck and his sister pretended to ask for directions, gaining an invitation into the house. Once they crossed the threshold of the Longs' home, Deck pulled a gun and threatened the elderly couple. He forced Zelma to open the safe, stealing about $200 in cash along with a few pieces of jewelry. Then, Deck ordered James and Zelma to lie face down on the bed. After nearly 10 agonizing minutes of hesitation and frantic thoughts, he fatally attacked both victims, two kind souls who had only offered help to strangers. Deck fled the scene but was arrested that same night. Inside his vehicle, police found the Longs' cash box and other stolen items. At the police station, Deck confessed fully through spoken statements, written accounts, and recorded interviews. In 1998, Carmen Deck was sentenced to death. However, due to procedural errors, including being shackled in front of the jury and failures by his defense team, the sentence was overturned twice. Finally, in 2008, after a third trial, the death sentence was reinstated over nearly 3 decades. Deck and his legal team fought for clemency, citing his traumatic childhood severe abuse, deep poverty, and victimization while in juvenile detention. Yet, all appeals were denied. On May 3, 2022, at Bonne Terre Correctional Center, Carmen Deck faced his final sentence, lethal injection, silent, like the tears never shed for his victims. Deck's final meal reflected surprising simplicity: a ribeye steak, grilled shrimp, steamed asparagus, a mixed salad with Italian dressing, cottage cheese, and a glass of V8 juice. In his final moments, Deck left behind a written statement, heavy with reflection. "My hope is that someday the world will find peace, and that we all learn to be kind and love one another. Give love, show love, be love." In the under the faded yellow lights, those last words echoed like a late prayer naming the love he had once so violently torn away. 9th, Kevin Johnson Jr. On the afternoon of July 5, 2005, in Kirkwood, Missouri, a tragic incident unfolded rooted in long-standing tensions between a struggling community and law enforcement. Kevin Johnson Jr., then 19 years old, was under heavy pressure, a precarious life, previous legal troubles, and deep family pain, especially the fragile health of his younger brother, Joseph Bam Bam Long, 12 years old. That afternoon, Kirkwood police officers arrived at Johnson's home to serve a warrant for a probation violation. While the officers were there, Joseph suffered a seizure. Some witnesses later claimed that the officers failed to assist in a timely manner. Joseph was taken to the hospital, but did not survive. In Kevin's eyes, his brother's death was the final breaking point, sinking into grief and fury. A few hours later, Johnson encountered Officer William McIntyre, a veteran officer who had been part of the earlier police response. In uncontrollable rage, Johnson committed a violent act, taking McIntyre's life, ending the career of a dedicated public servant with over 20 years of service. The investigation quickly identified Johnson as the prime suspect. After fleeing, he surrendered 2 days later. At trial, prosecutors argued that Johnson's actions were premeditated revenge. His defense team emphasized the overwhelming emotional trauma he endured after losing his brother, highlighting the hardships that had shaped his life. In 2007, Kevin Johnson was sentenced to death. However, the case continued to stir controversy for years, with allegations of racial bias in the prosecution and trial process. Despite support from human rights groups and social activists, all clemency efforts failed. On November 29, 2022, at Bonne Terre Correctional Center, Kevin Johnson Jr. faced his final moment lethal injection in a room weighed down by unanswered questions. Johnson declined a final meal. In his last moments, he whispered to his spiritual advisor, Reverend Darrell Gray, heavy words of regret. He apologized to the victim's family. He apologized to his own family. And he said he was looking forward to seeing his little brother. He said he was ready. As the light in the chamber dimmed, Missouri closed another painful chapter, where justice, grief, and helplessness intertwined into a knot not easily undone. 10th, Michael Anthony Taylor. On a spring morning in 1989, in Kansas City, Missouri, the disappearance of 15-year-old Ann Harrison marked the beginning of one of the most shocking criminal cases in the state's history. Ann Harrison, a vibrant and promising high school student, was waiting for her school bus near her home when she was abducted. Within hours, her family reported her missing, clinging to desperate hope, but that hope was soon shattered. Michael Anthony Taylor, along with accomplice Roderick Nunley, carried out a grim plan. They kidnapped Ann, took her to a house where she was held without consent and later killed. Ann's body was found in the trunk of an abandoned car, a tragic discovery that left the local community in shock. The investigation quickly pointed to Taylor and Nunley as the prime suspects. Both men were arrested, and during interrogations, they confessed fully to their crimes. Taylor stood trial in the early 1990s. Overwhelming evidence, coupled with his confession, left the jury little doubt. They sentenced him to death. Over the next 2 decades, Taylor pursued numerous appeals, citing ineffective counsel and requesting re-examinations of the evidence. Yet, through it all, the death sentence remained intact. On February 26, 2014, at Bonne Terre Correctional Center, Missouri, Michael Anthony Taylor faced his final moment. The method lethal injection, a procedure he once challenged as potentially causing unnecessary pain, but which ultimately proceeded without delay. Taylor declined a special last meal. Instead, he was served the standard prison meal potato soup and a sandwich. Before the injection, Taylor gave no final statement, only a heavy, oppressive silence filled the room. In that moment, Missouri closed another tragic chapter where a young girl's bright future was stolen away. And justice, though delivered, could never truly heal the irreparable loss. 11th, Michael Andrew Tisius. He was only 19, but on the night of June 22, 2000, Michael Tisius crossed the line from immaturity into the mind of a killer. It all began with whispered plans inside a cell at Randolph County Jail. Tisius and his cellmate, Roy Vance, a seasoned thief, plotted an escape. But instead of stealth, it ended in deadly violence. After being released, Tisius didn't return home. He quietly prepared weapons and headed back to the jail where only 2 guards were working the night shift. What he carried wasn't remorse. It was live ammunition. 2 gunshots echoed. 2 lives were lost. They weren't enemies. They weren't criminals. Just 2 men doing their jobs, Jason Acton and Leon Egley, killed for simply being on duty. Tisius was arrested shortly after without resistance. He knew the road had ended. In court, his lawyers cited mitigating factors: his youth, emotional trauma, and the fact that he was easily influenced. But to the jury, the lives of 2 husbands, 2 fathers could not be erased by the word immature. The death sentence was handed down. A teenager not even 20 officially became a man on death row. Tisius lived more than 2 decades on death row. He learned to draw rote poems and letters. Human rights groups pleaded for clemency, citing his age at the time of the crime. But Missouri stood firm. On June 6, 2023, Michael Andrew Tisius entered the death chamber at Bonne Terre Prison. His final meal was simple, almost childlike: 2 bacon cheeseburgers, regular and curly fries, and a chocolate milkshake. Just before the injection, Tisius said only, "I'm sorry." 2 plain words. No justification, no resistance. Yet, they couldn't bring back the lives of 2 men who fell because they showed up for work. 8 family members of the victims were present at the execution. They didn't speak publicly, they didn't cry, they weren't angry, they were just silent. Mark Nichols, former sheriff of Randolph County and once the victim's superior, said, I think this will allow Jason and Leon's families to begin healing. They no longer have to endure endless appeals or relive this nightmare over and over. Because sometimes, pain doesn't scream. It just leaves one empty chair at the dinner table. Forever. 12th, Walter E. Barton. On October 9, 1991, in the town of Ozark, Missouri, 81-year-old Gladys Queeler, a beloved and respected member of the community, was found dead in her home within the trailer park she managed. She was known for helping tenants and had adopted a daughter she loved as her own. Just hours earlier, she had invited a few people, including Walter Barton, to help clean up after the funeral of her adopted daughter's husband. Several people were at the trailer park that day, and Barton was reportedly the last person to see her alive. About 45 minutes after leaving her home, Barton returned with another person. According to his statement, he found her unconscious inside. He claimed he had tried to help, and that's how her blood ended up on his clothes. However, police quickly identified Barton as the prime suspect. His shirt and pants contained 3 small blood stains, which the Missouri State Crime Lab said matched the victim's DNA. The case also relied on testimony from a fellow inmate who claimed Barton had confessed while in jail, though the credibility of that statement was later heavily questioned. Despite proclaiming his innocence, Barton was arrested and charged in a case that would span nearly 3 decades with controversy that never faded. The legal battle stretched over a decade, involving 5 trials and 2 overturned convictions due to procedural errors. Independent legal groups, including the Innocence Project, argued that the evidence was weak, built on unreliable testimony and questionable blood analysis. Still, in 2006, Barton was sentenced to death. More than 14 years later, Missouri carried out the execution, ignoring calls to delay it for further investigation. On May 19, 2020, at Bonne Terre Prison, Walter Barton was taken to the death chamber. His final meal was elaborate: a double bacon cheeseburger, cheesy hash browns, banana cream pie cherry, Dr. Pepper barbecued pork, baked potato with cheese, and pecan pie with a scoop of vanilla ice cream. When asked for his final words, he lifted his head and spoke clearly, "I, Walter Archie Barton, am innocent, and they are executing an innocent man." He was the first person executed in the United States after the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Outside protesters held signs that read, "If there's doubt, stop." The victim's family, Gladys Keeler's relatives, did not attend the execution, but some later said that while the loss was unbearable, justice had to be served. Even after Barton's death, one question remains: was this justice, or the tragedy of a system that can make mistakes? 13. Russell Earl Buckloo. Russell Buckloo is no stranger to American criminal justice history. But not only for his crimes, he became known for the way Missouri chose to execute him, despite a legal battle that lasted nearly 20 years. In 1996, Buckloo launched a violent attack aimed at his ex-girlfriend's new partner. He committed a violent assault involving multiple victims and weapons. After fleeing, he was caught in a gunfight with police, during which he was also wounded. The case shocked the public not just for the personal motive, but for its sheer brutality. The court sentenced Buckloo to death shortly after. But the story didn't end there. Buckloo suffered from a rare medical condition, cavernous hemangioma, which caused large blood-filled tumors in his head, neck, and throat. Doctors expressed concern that the method of execution could lead to significant suffering due to his condition. A legal fight began. Buckloo requested execution by nitrogen gas, a method considered less painful. Missouri refused. The case reached the United States Supreme Court. In April 2019, the court ruled 5-4. The Constitution does not guarantee a painless death. Missouri could proceed with lethal injection. On October 1, 2019, at Bonne Terre Prison, Russell Buckloo entered the death chamber. Despite concerns, the execution went forward without major complications, at least according to staff present. His final meal included a gyro sandwich, smoked meat, 2 orders of fries, a can of soda, and banana pudding. A meal full of fat meat and sweetness, perhaps the last thing he could freely choose. His final words were not officially recorded. Media reports only noted that he spoke a few words to his family and attorney before receiving the first injection. The victims' families did not speak publicly, but court records describe years of trauma, fear, and loss following the attack. To many, Russell Buckloo symbolizes a justice system that shows no mercy, but to others, his case is a reminder. Even for the guilty, death should be seen through the lens of justice and humanity. 14th, David Zinc. Night had just fallen along a quiet stretch of highway near Strafford, Missouri. 19-year-old Amanda Morton, a bright and promising college student, was driving home after visiting a friend when another car struck the rear of her vehicle. The impact wasn't severe, but the man who stepped out, David Zinc, already had a plan in motion. There were no witnesses, no surveillance cameras. On a pitch-black road with no streetlights, Zinc forced Amanda out of her car. That was the last moment she was seen free. The next morning, Amanda's Chevrolet Cavalier was found. The engine was still running, headlights on, hazard lights blinking. The driver's window rolled down, her purse and phone left behind. But Amanda was gone. Her family immediately contacted police. Panic spread, and a statewide search began. A breakthrough came when a motel clerk in Camdenton, about 80 miles from the scene, recognized Amanda's photo on the news. She recalled the young woman had checked in with a man named David Zinc. The information was turned over to the authorities. Police tracked Zinc to his parents' home. He didn't resist. He didn't deny. He calmly confessed from the staged crash to taking Amanda to a remote location and committing a brutal act in a cemetery meant for eternal rest. His confession shocked investigators, not just for the crime, but for the chilling ease with which he told the story, like checking something off a list. Zinc's trial moved swiftly. With his criminal record, full confession, and corroborating evidence, a death sentence was inevitable. He spent 11 years on death row. There were no drawn-out appeals, no human rights campaigns, just silence from a man who knew what he had done. On July 14, 2015, David Zinc entered the death chamber at Bonne Terre Prison. His final meal was simple: a grilled cheese sandwich, fries, cheesecake, and a soda. As plain as his quiet surrender to fate. Before the injection, Zinc said, "I can't imagine the pain Amanda's family and friends have suffered. I offer my sincerest apology. I hope this brings them peace." Amanda Morton's family was present. They didn't cry, they didn't speak, but their gaze, like a final verdict, would never forget. To many, Zinc was justice served. But for those who see the darkness in the human soul, his story is a tragedy of a life that could have taken a different road, but chose to drive into the night. 15th, Michael Shane Worthington. On the night of September 30th, 1995, at a quiet apartment complex in Lake St. Louis, Missouri, 24-year-old Melinda Mindy Griffin, a senior finance student at the University of Missouri St. Louis, became the victim of a brutal crime. Her neighbor, Michael Shane Worthington, broke into her apartment through a window and committed acts that would end her life. After the murder, he stole her car, jewelry, credit cards, and phone. Worthington was arrested the next day, caught driving Mindy's car, and confessed immediately. DNA evidence confirmed his admission. At his 1998 trial, Worthington pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, rape, and robbery. He was sentenced to death and never appealed the verdict. During his time on death row, he and his lawyers filed for clemency, arguing the death penalty was unfair and driven by vengeance. But Missouri Governor Jay Nixon denied the request, and the United States Supreme Court refused to delay the execution. On August 6, 2014, Michael Shane Worthington, age 43, was executed by lethal injection at the Eastern Reception Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre. He was pronounced dead at 12:11 in the morning. His final meal, like a typical night at a classic American diner, included a cheeseburger, French fries, a ribeye steak, and crispy fried onions. Nothing extravagant. Nothing symbolic. Just his choice for one final dinner. When asked for last words, Worthington spoke without hesitation. His voice was clear and firm. "Thank you. I'm finally at peace with my true father. I won't suffer anymore." It's my friends and family who have truly suffered. May God forgive those who call this justice, because in truth this was about politics and revenge. Amen. And peace to you all." Mindy's mother, Carol Angelbeck, witnessed the execution. She later shared, "I feel relief that he's dead. I won't have to face him or the legal system again. Now, it's only about Mindy." Michael Shane Worthington's case sparked debate over the death penalty, particularly around transparency and the source of lethal drugs. But for Mindy Griffin's family, the execution brought closure to a nearly 20-year chapter of pain. 16th, Mark Anthony Christensen. On the morning of February 1, 1998, the calm of rural Vichy, Missouri was shattered by one of the most disturbing crimes in the state's history. Inside a small home on a dirt road, Susan Brooke, a single mother, was starting an ordinary day with her two children, 12-year-old Adrian and 9-year-old Kyle. Mark Anthony Christensen, age 18, and his 17-year-old cousin Jesse Carter had just escaped from a juvenile facility. They were planning to steal and flee the state. But when they saw the Brooke home, the plan took a darker, violent turn. They broke in not to rob, but to take control. Christensen restrained the family and assaulted Susan. Then the three were forced into Susan's Dodge Caravan and driven to a pond several miles away. Along the way, Adrian tried to escape but failed. All three victims were forced to the ground. One by one, their lives were taken and their bodies left in the pond. The legal documents revealed a level of cruelty that stunned investigators, especially knowing Adrian and Kyle were too young to understand what was happening. Christensen and Carter fled the state with the stolen vehicle and belongings. But within 2 weeks, they were arrested in California after police identified the van and traced it back to them. They were extradited to Missouri. At trial, Jesse Carter cooperated with prosecutors and testified against his cousin in exchange for a life sentence. Christensen, who had taken the lead in the crime, received the death penalty. His appeals dragged on for over a decade, delayed in part by a mistake from his original attorneys who filed the appeal 117 days late. As a result, the courts rejected all of Christensen's claims based on procedure. The U.S. Supreme Court later appointed new counsel, but it was too late to change the outcome. On January 31, 2017, Mark Christensen was executed by lethal injection at the Eastern Reception Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre. He was pronounced dead at 7:05 in the evening. His final meal was simple but complete: a bacon cheeseburger, crispy fries, a slice of pecan pie, and a cold can of soda. No flair, no drama, just one last taste of something familiar. Before the injection, when asked if he had any last words, Christensen looked toward the witnesses and said, "Please let my family know that I love them with all my heart. I feel so very blessed to have them in my life, and thank God for giving me such a wonderful family." After nearly 2 decades of waiting for justice, the victim's family finally felt relief. Harley Brooke, the half-sister of Adrian and Kyle, shared, "19 years ago, my siblings were taken from me. Today, we finally have justice for them." 17th, Johnny Allen Johnson. On the morning of July 26, 2002 in Valley Park, Missouri, a small town where everyone knows each other, 6-year-old Casey Williamson suddenly vanished from her mother's home. She was spending the summer with her biological father, Ernie Williamson. The last person to see her was her father, who had stepped out of the bathroom for just a moment. When he returned, Casey was gone. After 30 minutes of frantic searching, the family contacted police. A massive search operation began. Police, FBI agents, search dogs, and hundreds of volunteers poured into Valley Park. Posters with Casey's innocent face appeared everywhere. But hope quickly turned into dread. A witness recalled seeing Johnny Johnson, a familiar face in the community, 24 years old, carrying Casey away that morning. Johnson had once lived in the neighborhood and had received help from the Williamson family. Few knew he had a history of mental illness and had been treated in psychiatric facilities. Police soon identified him as a suspect. Just hours later, Johnson was arrested. In custody, he confessed, admitting to taking Casey to an abandoned glass factory and describing what happened afterward. Casey, a first grader, never came home. In 2005, Johnson was sentenced to death. His lawyers argued for years that he had schizophrenia and lacked the mental capacity to be executed. They claimed he believed his death would trigger the apocalypse caused by Satan. But the courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, rejected all appeals. On August 1, 2023, Johnny Johnson, age 45, was executed by lethal injection at the Eastern Reception Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre. He was pronounced dead at 6:33 in the evening. His final meal was simple: a bacon cheeseburger topped with cheese golden curly fries and a cold strawberry milkshake. Nothing remarkable, but it was the final choice of a man who had strayed far from anything right. Just before the drugs entered his system, Johnson whispered his last words, "God bless. I'm sorry to the people and families I've hurt." Casey Williamson's family waited over 20 years to see justice fulfilled. Though some relatives opposed the death penalty, many believed the execution was necessary to close this painful chapter in their lives. 18th, William Rousan. On September 21, 1993, in the quiet countryside near Bonne Terre, Missouri, a horrific crime shattered the peace of a rural community. 37-year-old William Rousan, along with his 16-year-old son Brent and his brother Robert, planned to steal livestock from the farm of elderly couple Charles and Grace Lewis. But the plan turned deadly. Charles and Grace were killed and buried in a shallow grave under debris. The crime remained undiscovered for nearly a year until a hunter found the couple's burned-out truck in a remote area. The investigation soon led to the arrest of the three suspects. Robert Rousan cooperated with authorities and pled guilty to second-degree murder. He received a 15-year sentence and was released in 2001. Brent Rousan was sentenced to life without parole. William Rousan, as the mastermind behind the killings, was sentenced to death. Throughout the trial and appeals process, Rousan showed no remorse. At one point, he even made conflicting claims, including an accusation that the victim's son had hired him to kill his parents, a claim for which no evidence was ever found. On April 23, 2014, William Rousan, age 57, was executed by lethal injection at the Eastern Reception Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre. He was pronounced dead at 12:10 in the morning. Before the injection, Rousan said, "My trials and mistakes have been many. But thanks be to Lord Jesus, I have a new home in his heavenly kingdom. May forgiveness and peace be found for all in Christ Jesus." His final meal was modest: a bacon cheeseburger, crispy onion rings, a cold soda, and a sweet slice of pecan pie. In his final moment, he chose simplicity, as if trying to end life's chaos with something familiar. 5 members of the victim's family witnessed the execution. Michael Lewis, the couple's son, later said he felt no relief or satisfaction as nothing could bring his parents back. 19th, Herbert Smalls. At noon on July 27, 1991, in the bustling commercial district of Chesterfield, Missouri, 29-year-old Herbert Smalls and 15-year-old Norman Brown walked into F&M Crown Jewels. Posing as customers shopping for engagement rings, they were welcomed by the owner's 51-year-old Stephen Honigman and his wife, 44-year-old Florence. As Stephen turned away, Smalls drew a gun. In a split second, a routine business transaction turned into an armed robbery. Smalls opened fire, resulting in Stephen's death. Florence survived by pretending to be unconscious. That instinct saved her life. The 2 robbers fled, taking jewelry, diamond rings, and K-Roors. The crime, committed in broad daylight in a busy area, sent shockwaves through the community. Thanks to Florence's vivid description, police identified the suspects later that same day. Smalls was arrested soon after, and the evidence led directly to him. He was sentenced to death in 1992, but the appeals process stretched over 2 decades. One major point of contention was that the only black juror was removed, resulting in an all-white jury. Smalls' attorneys argued this violated his constitutional rights, but the courts declined to reopen the case. On January 29, 2014, after multiple delays, Herbert Smalls was executed by lethal injection at the Bonne Terre prison. He did not offer final words, only nodding to two witnesses. The injection process lasted 9 minutes. He was pronounced dead at 10:20 at night. His final meal had a traditional Southern flavor, crispy fried chicken, a hearty steak, tender, collard greens, creamy mac and cheese, and sweet candied yams. It ended with warm cornbread chocolate cake and a cold can of cola. In his final hours, Smalls didn't seek extravagance. He returned to the tastes of his youth. As the drugs entered his system, he said little. But, in the stillness of the room, he whispered through labored breath, "My body feels like it's heating up." 20th, Alan Nicholson. On a sweltering August afternoon in 1994, along Interstate 70 near Kingdom City, Missouri, an old Chevrolet Caprice carrying 3 men, Alan Nicholson, Dennis Skillicorn, and Tim DeGraffenreid, suddenly broke down in the middle of the road. The trio was en route from Kansas City to St. Louis to buy drugs armed with guns and ammunition stolen days earlier from a nearby home. As they struggled with the car, a man pulled over to help. That man was 47-year-old Richard Drummond, a kind-hearted AT&T telecommunications engineer who didn't hesitate to assist strangers. But that kindness was repaid with cruelty. Nicholson pulled a gun and forced Drummond to let the group into his car and keep driving. Drummond complied, likely hoping to defuse the situation peacefully. Eventually, they ordered him to turn onto a dirt road leading into the woods of Lafayette County. There, in the quiet of nature, Alan Nicholson ended Richard Drummond's life. He never returned home. After the murder, Nicholson and Skillicorn fled west to Arizona, where they committed 2 more killings before being captured and extradited back to Missouri. Skillicorn was executed in 2009. Nicholson continued to appeal for nearly 2 decades, repeatedly citing issues with his legal representation. But on December 11, 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court denied his final appeal, clearing the way for his execution. His final meal was served around 4 in the evening on December 10, 2013. He chose a simple meal, a meat pizza, and a glass of orange juice. The next morning, he made no special requests. He ate the standard prison breakfast just like every other inmate. When the time came, Alan Nicholson offered no final words to the public. He simply bowed his head in silent prayer with the prison chaplain, a moment shared only between him and God. Crimes punished, lives ended, and questions left hanging in the cold air. Was justice truly served, or was it just another cycle of pain? If these stories moved you, please like this video, leave a comment below to share your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another raw glimpse into the dark side of justice. Stories like these, are far from over.